Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Excel Your Questions Answered. This is part of SIPFA's Technology in Focus series, and if you've missed some of them throughout the year, we have a catalog of some of those that have been pre-recorded, and you can access them. Just go to the SIPFA website and type in finance technology, and you should be able to find some of those. Not everything gets recorded, and not everything gets put on the website, so do look out in your member newsletter to hear about our future events. So today's session, we've got David Lyford Tilly, who is an Excel trainer and blogger, and he'll be answering your questions live today. Now, if you've submitted questions beforehand, whilst everyone else is typing their questions in the question and answer block, David can go through some of those questions that have been pre-submitted to us. And so do please feel free to pop your questions in, and what will happen is you can also go and check other people's questions and upvote them if that's something that resonates with you and you feel like, oh, I really would be interested in that. That allows us to prioritize the questions that we answer today. So thank you for joining us, and over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Florence, and thanks everybody for joining. I just wanted to make note before I get started that we're just going to be doing a little bit of Q&A today. We are going to cover questions that were submitted beforehand, but also taking live questions from the audience. So Florence mentioned already, but there is a Q&A feature that you can use. Really encourage you to have a think. If there's any Excel question, big or small, that you want me to consider over the course of the next hour, let me know. We will cover as much as we can in that time, but just to note that SIPFA does also have some on-demand Excel courses that you can do online, so you can see some details about how these are set out here on the screen. So that's an option as well if you want to get a little bit more into using Excel in your role. So with that all being said, I'm going to switch over now to do things in actual Excel. What I've got here, because we're just doing questions, I haven't prepared any particular topics, but what I have prepared is some kind of dummy data, so that regardless of what your questions might be, hopefully I'll have some data pre-prepared that I can use to help answer those. So while I'm giving you all a chance to have a think and input your questions, I'm going to take some questions that were submitted in advance. And I'm actually going to start with this quite big question. AI within Excel, Copilot, and how much we can really trust it. So I'm not going to demonstrate anything here, if nothing else, because the Excel version that I'm using here on my SIPFA laptop isn't fully the latest version, which has the Copilot plugin, or even the even more up-to-date version that if you're on the Insider channel, you might have the equals Copilot function available now. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit in general. And also just to know, Florence mentioned we're doing this Technology in Focus series, and we've done several webinars and sessions through that on the subject of AI and AI risk and governance as well. So I will direct you to those for a fuller discussion. Within Excel specifically, I've had a pretty extensive play around with the Copilot functionality. It's decent. It can write some formulas. It can do a bit of data transformation for you. It isn't perfect. You do need to check, like any LLM or AI system, you do need to check its work. It doesn't always get the gist of what you want every time. But it has got a pretty reliable engine, and it does understand Excel formulas and the like. So you can get some useful ideas out of it, but you do need to check that it's understood you properly and it's implemented solutions correctly. It won't always have done that. So it is important with any AI system really to check over it. So that's my kind of high level thoughts on Copilot in Excel. I'm going to come back to this VBA question. I'm going to tackle that in a moment. There's another question about conditional formatting along with a lookup condition. They've said VLOOKUP, but I'm actually going to do this not with VLOOKUP. So you can absolutely do a bit of lookup work in combination with conditional formatting. So conditional formatting lets you change the formatting of a cell based on some sort of a condition. So it lets you kind of automatically change color or font or something like that based on what is in the cell. But it doesn't just have to be directly what's on the cell. You can actually do a formula to the cell first. So I'm going to create an example here. I've got a list of invoices here, and I'm going to create a bit of an example for us to work with. So here are all of my different approvers for my invoice, and I'm going to say that Gauss, Euler, and Fermat are low risk, and we'll say that Fermat and Harron are high risk. So I've kind of put a risk rating here. What I now want to do is use conditional formatting to highlight, let's say, the invoice number if the invoice was approved by a high-risk person. And the way that I'm going to do that is with a formula. Now, the example talked about VLOOKUP. I wouldn't use VLOOKUP for this. I would use XLOOKUP, which is in most all modern versions of Excel and is just a better formula. So let me first of all show you what the formula looks like if it's just typed into a cell. So XLOOKUP lets you look up a value. So in this case, we're going to be looking up the approver name. Then you tell it where to look for that. I'm going to look for that in this lookup array, and then where to return. I'm going to return in this return array. I'm also actually going to not use the dynamic array style of referencing for this particular process. I'm going to do it using the more traditional cell references, and I'm also going to do that all with $signs. So if I do that, I can copy that down my whole table now. And now you can see that formula looks up the approver in each case and returns whether that approver is a high or a low risk approver. To combine that with conditional formatting, I'm going to make sure that I do all of my cell references using the traditional cell reference style, not G3, F3, rather than doing anything using any special references. That will make this a bit more reliable. I'm going to copy this formula here, and then I'm going to go to Home, Conditional Formatting, New Rule. That will pop out the new formatting rule option. I'm going to ask to use a formula to determine which cells to format, and I'm going to paste my formula in here. So this will use the value of the cell F3, which is the one I had selected when I went into the conditional formatting menu. It will use this to evaluate, to look up whether the risk level of that particular person, and I'm going to say equals quote mark high quote mark. So that's going to look up the appropriate approver name, check whether they're on my list of high ones, and then I just need to tell it what format I want. I'm just going to do a nice quick example with a red fill. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to manage by rule, and I'm going to apply that not just to F3, but to the whole column. Apply, and there we go. Now I have a red rule being applied for any of the high risk people. And because this is a formula, if I come back later and I say that actually now I think Euler is high risk, I can change my source table here and the formatting automatically updates as well. And obviously that works both ways. I can take people out of the high risk list as well. So that's a dynamic look at how to do conditional formatting with a bit of a formula in there, specifically in this case, a lookup formula. I am going to go back to my list of questions. Is there a quick way to save a copy of an Excel document with no formula and no links, so a clean copy where the figures cannot update? There are a couple of ways to do this. Probably the quickest way is to paste values, the whole thing. So if you've got and this works just for a single range as well, so I'll just do it for a single range. If I was doing it for the whole sheet, I might want to select the whole sheet. And I'll talk about whole workbook versions in a moment. If I just want to do it for some cells, you can go Control-C for copy, Control-Copy, and then to paste the values, so removing the formulas, there's actually a keyboard shortcut for that. It's Control and Shift and V. And now you can see that my cells don't have formulas in anymore. They are just hard-coded values. So that would be one option. You could also save it as a file type that doesn't support formulas. So for example, the CSV file type doesn't support formulas. So if you save something with formulas in that format, it will remove the formulas and just leave the values. It does also lose your formatting and a whole bunch of other things though. So I don't think that's the great way of doing it. I would go with the paste values option. And if you're dealing with a really big spreadsheet, maybe you could write a bit of VBA to do that for each sheet automatically to speed it up a little bit. But basically I would do that. That being said, to be honest, my personal preference is to leave formulas in wherever possible, because otherwise people can draw the wrong conclusion from your workbook. They might think a figure is up to date when actually it isn't. It's hard coded. They might not understand where a figure comes from, and the formula would help them to understand the data better. So actually, my real answer is try to avoid doing that if you don't have to. Going to work on the couple other questions here, and then we'll come to the ones from the live audience. One of these questions just said financial analysis, which I can't really do much with, but if you're in the audience and you can explain a bit more what you're looking to do, then do tell us a little bit more and I'll try and get into that. So one was talking about how to setting up reconciliations in a way for reviewing. So how to get different things that are easy to follow, something that people can follow through. This is another example where it's a little bit dependent on who you're working with as to what they will find easy to understand. But the question talks about Power Query a little bit, so I thought I'd run through an example of how you might compare lists. I'm using a list of names here, but for a reconciliation it would be figures and possibly labels as well. But the core of the process is pretty similar, and some ways you might think about that. We did a webinar maybe a couple months ago now, which was an introduction to Power Query. So if you're looking to get started with Power Query from the beginning, I would suggest having a look at that webinar for a slightly more detailed look at it. But if you're just wanting a bit of an interest, a sort of intro to the subject, I'm just going to do a very quick version here. And in particular, I'm just going to note I have already, if I open my existing connections, loaded my January data in earlier. I'll show you how this is a list of employees. I'll show you how to do it for the February one. I'm just going to come to the data tab and use from table range. That will automatically pull the February data into the Power Query editor, which you shouldn't see up here on the screen. And then when I'm done with it, I can say close and load to, and say that I just want to load that data to create a connection to it. I don't want to output it anywhere. I just want to have it attached. So if I want to compare the January and February lists automatically using Power Query, then I have the option to create a new query, which I'm going to do with my Get Data menu. I'm going to choose to combine queries, and specifically, I am going to merge two queries. And there's a couple of ways I can do this, but I'm going to do it by taking the January table, taking the February table, and I'm going to do a join that is called a full outer join. So a full outer join will include all of the items from both lists, and it will match them up wherever possible. So let me press OK, and you'll see what that actually looks like. So here we go. I have got my January items. My February items are currently hidden as a table, but I'm going to expand that out with this double arrow here. And I'm going to expand it into a new column that is just called February. Press OK. It does pick up a .1 in the name for some reason, which I'll remove. So now you can see if something is in both labels, it will appear in both columns. If it's only in the February label, it will have a null value in the corresponding January table. And if I come down to the bottom here are the items where it's in the January table, but not in the February one. So it's a null value on the right-hand side. So that's what a full outer join does, is it gives me, it kind of lines up the rows from the two tables in a combined way. And if I want to now move on to doing a reconciliation, one way that I could do that is I can add a column. I'm going to add a custom column from add column, custom column. I'm going to put in here comparison. That's going to be the name of my column. And now I'm going to create a formula that will categorize what type of name this is. So let's imagine this is payroll. So this is going to be written, and if you've not written a Power Query M formula before, the if formula is kind of written a little bit, mostly like a sentence actually. I'm going to say if, and I'm going to double click on January to refer to the January column. If January is null, then, so what does January null mean? Does that mean that it wasn't in January and it was in February? Then I'm going to call that a joiner. Else if February is null, then that means they were in January and they weren't in February. I'm going to call that a leaver. Else, so in all other cases, I'm going to put common. So that is a kind of explanation to Excel of how I want that formula to work, that column to work. And don't worry about the syntax too much here. We are recording the webinar, so if you want to go over this in detail, you can do so with the recording. We're also going to share the workbook that I've got here after the fact as well. So let me just do that. Now I've got my comparison. I'm just going to call this reconciliation. That'll be the name of my my query here. And actually the ones that I have in common I'm not interested in, so I'm going to filter those out using the filter column. So now I've just got a list of joiners and leavers, like so. And I'm actually pretty happy with that, but I'm going to go ahead and export that. So I'm going to say close and load to, and I am going to put it onto a table, and I'm going to have it actually appear on my existing worksheet just here. And that can create something like this that shows me my joiners and my leavers. So you could do more to make this even easier to follow. And I think you could also do something like have a list of people who you are expecting as joiners and leavers, and then you can compare the lists in the same process that what we just did with making a merge. You could compare the list of joiners per your HR system to this list of differences. If you were doing this with financial amounts, you might have other kinds of balances. So you might make multiple different lists and can repeatedly combine and compare them together in order to categorize into different groups or to remove, expected variances versus unexpected variances. You can use this sort of step-by-step process, and you can add labels using functions to make it easier to communicate how the reconciliation is working. So that process kind of lets you to carry this out. And the nice thing here is that, I did this with columns that were called January and February, but if you just had a prior month, current month column, you could just move the data each month, refresh this query, and it would repeat that whole process that we went through and give us the same list of steps at the end each time. I'm just going to put a list on. We had one thing I wanted to come back to, which is this question on Visual Basic. I have put together an example for this one, and I'm going to show you it working. Hopefully, it worked when I did it earlier. I'm not going to run through this in a lot of detail because Visual Basic is a whole programming language with a lot of syntax, a lot of special terminology, a lot of detail to it, but I just wanted to show it and talk about it in the briefest sense. So let's have a look at what the question was. So previous employee would have a drop-down menu on an Excel sheet, and the amounts would change based on the item chosen from the drop-down. They want to make a new file for each different option from the dropdown. So if there were 10 items, you'd want to be easily and quickly creating 10 files with the relevant information in each. So I've come up with a way of doing that, which I've got over here. It's called splitter source file. So this is actually the same list of invoices that we used in the example earlier. I have got a formula that has spit out each individual vendor into a list. So this is the 5 different vendors that we have. And then I have got a number here, which you can use to pick an item from the list. And I have a formula here, which then in turn spits that out. And what I've done is I've written an Excel VBA subroutine, which is up on the screen currently. And as I said, I'm not going to run through this in detail, but I will sketch out how it works. It automatically it starts by figuring out where the current workbook is saved and remembering that this current workbook is the one that we want to work with. It then looks at the list of vendors in column I, which you can see is the column I have my list of vendors in, and keeps an eye on this picker. So this is a named cell that I've called picker that it uses to decide which one it's currently looking at. It then counts how many vendors are in the vendor list by going through and counting how many filled in cells there are in column I. And then it will then, for I is 1 to vendor count, which means basically we're going to cycle through each vendor. We're going to activate the starting file, set the picker to a particular number, remember the name of that item as for the name of our new file, copy the second sheet here, which is the one where I've got my filter that is actually pulling out just the invoices related to the what's picked on the first sheet. So if I change this to a 2, you'll see that this changes to a new list. Then we're going to save that copy in the new location, and then we move on to the next one, and eventually we'll have a message box that says the completed. So that's the goal for what we're going to be doing here. Moment of truth. Let's run the file. This will take a moment, and the screen might look a bit funny while the VBA is running, but it's creating those files, saving each of them in turn. Waiting till that's all done. Okay, I've got a message that says it's completed. Now that's looking like it's all done. If I were to come to my Excel folder and I've got this VBA splitter folder, which is where this example is saved. So there we go. There's my source file, and it has now created 5 additional files with each of the vendors, and it saved them in that same location. So thankfully, it all worked perfectly that time. Now, I'm going to close all of these extra files that have been opened now, but as mentioned, I am going to I'll send this file around as well when it's finished. I didn't, by the way, you'll see these are causing ref issues. That's because I've closed the file that they're pointing at. I left it as a form with formulas. In this version, you could also add a step that paste values is at the end as well if you wanted. I chose not to include that, but that would be a thing you could choose to do. And in fact, that's all of the questions from our pre-submitted list. So what I'm going to do now is come over and have a look at our live question list and see what we've got. So, question first of all from Monica. So let's have a look at this one. Do you have tips when you paste tables from Excel to Word, especially for preparing the statement of accounts? Thank you. It depends so it's certainly very true that Excel table formatting doesn't always carry over perfectly into other contexts. Now, there are some examples where you don't necessarily have to. So just purely copying the contents of an Excel table into a Word table, you'll probably find that the formatting will go a bit wrong. The pagination might not come across neatly. It can just be a bit unreliable. You can do things like pasting an image, so you can copy from Excel and paste that as an image in the Word, which of course isn't going to be live updated, but will retain the look of the original Excel table. You can also embed an Excel object within a Word document, although that starts to get more slow on the memory and it can be a little bit less convenient. So depending on what you're looking to do, there's a couple of different ways of attempting that kind of task. I think the best thing to do, and perhaps if we've got time, you can submit a sort of bit more detail about your example, or of course we can give it a bit more of a detailed try during the presentation, and we can have a look at what that might look like. Or we can also follow up after the webinar as well. If you've got a bit more of a detailed example that you want to submit, we can have a look at that offline. So thank you, Monica. And if you want to know more, just give us a little bit more info. Anonymous question next. And by the way, I'm just taking these in the order. Actually, I'm going to switch to put most upvotes. There we go. I didn't have it in most upvotes before. So let's go to most upvotes because Sandra's question here does have an upvote. And I'm going to take a drink while this is on screen because it's quite a long one. Is there a way to quickly and automatically search for inconsistent formulas in large data sets, please? We use large Excel files, some with hundreds of columns and thousands of rows for our year-end working papers, with formulas in many of the columns. The formulas should be the same all the way down the column, but sometimes we need to override the odd formula with a hard-coded number. When we roll the file forward into the following year, we need to reset all the formulas, and doing this by painstakingly scrolling down each column to search for inconsistencies. Would welcome a quicker and more accurate method of doing this. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 2 different things here. I'm going to talk about how to identify formulas that are different from their neighbors, and I'm going to talk about how to quickly remedy it. So let's start by making numbers 1 to 10 and making a formula that multiplies the neighboring number by 2. bit of a noddy example, but hopefully that will be easy to do. And this one I'm going to change to by 3. Now, as you probably know, if you do have a formula that is different from its neighbors, Excel will actually usually give you a little triangle mark here and say inconsistent formula. It does spot that kind of error. Specifically, it's if the formula is sandwiched between 2 copies of the same formula, and this one is different to the 2 it's sandwiched between, then it will notice and it will say, "Ooh, are you sure about that?" Now, obviously, that's fine if you can see the formula, but you're talking about thousands of rows. The fact that there's a little tiny green triangle on row 612, you're not necessarily going to spot that. But there are some things you can do that will help spot things like this. So you have got some specific options in the formula auditing section for doing things like error checking and tracing and so forth. But for things like this, what you can also do, if you go to Home, Find and Select, go to Special, you can go in, look into the column differences, and that will automatically highlight the formula that is any formula that is different to the ones in the column. So no matter how big your data is, and if I have several of these, so let me just do that. You can, I'll do the same thing again, Home, Find and Select, go to Special, column differences, okay, and there you go, it highlights automatically the 2 cells that have a different formula from the rest of the column. So that's an option of how you could find the differences very quickly. If you were looking at comparing formulas that were supposed to be copied rightwards, you'd do the same, but you'd pick row differences instead of column differences. The other option is how to quickly ensure that all the formulas are the same. I, for that, would just take the one at the top and the formula at the top and copy it down the column. But there is a quick way of doing that, actually. You might know the little square at the bottom of the cell. If you hover it, you get a plus. You can click and drag to copy that formula. However, if it's in a situation like this where it's next to a column of data, if you just double click that square, it will copy it down the whole row automatically. So you can do that very quickly and easily. The other option actually on spotting them is if you use Excel tables. So let me say number and calculation. Let me just quickly copy paste values that. If you use a format as table, format, so this is from the home menu, you've got format as table. You can do that, or you can press Control T to format this as a table. You get this special Excel formatting, and this actually also lets you easily, if you type a formula into any cell of the column, it automatically applies that to every cell of the column. You can undo to make it different, but then you will see that you get this same error, inconsistent calculated column formula. So the Excel tables does make it a little easier to keep your columns consistent as well. So that's one option. A more kind of best practice approach might be to, if you're going to make exceptional formulas or hard-coded values, not change the formula, but to have a second column where you have an override value. So you might have something like base calculation, which is the consistent formula, then a column that says exceptions, and then you can say exception here, and then you can say exceptional figure, and say, okay, well, actually, for that one particular row, I want it to be 16 instead. And then you could have final figure. And then all you have to do is say, if the exceptions is an X, then we are going to use the exceptional figure, and otherwise we'll use the base calculation. And that gives me completely consistent formulas in both of the columns that have formulas, but still have the ability to override the basic formula if I want to. And then all I would have to do, and when I'm done and rolling forward to the next year, is delete the flag for the exceptionals, for the exceptions. And that means I don't have to mix and match exceptional formulas. I can just have one consistent formula, which I think is generally better practice. So that would be how I might think about setting up something like that. Okay, let's go back to the questions, take the next one on the list. So let me first of all mark Sandra's question as done, refresh the list. Okay, so taking it from the most upvotes, the current top one is anonymous attendee. I never use pivot table, but go crazy for tables and sum ifs. Am I missing out? I don't know about missing out, Anonymous. You certainly can do a lot of things with Excel tables, like the one I've just shown here, and sum ifs. But pivots are helpful because they are much quicker. So if I were looking at some tabular data, let's go back to my invoices, and I wanted to make a summary of this. You absolutely could do this with a sum if formula. The option to go insert pivot table of my data and then just go, I would like the vendors and the amounts, and I'd like to split by whether or not they're paid. There we go. That took, what, 10 seconds? You can absolutely do that with formulas, but they're just so easy and quick to do this with pivots. You can just go bish bash bosh, put things in, drag the labels of the columns into the box, the areas where you want to see them, over the rows, over the columns as the values, and just get a really quick and easy summary that doesn't require you to write any formulas at all. So I think that they're definitely worth having a look at. And if you are absolutely a lover of formulas, by the way, I should say that in the newer versions of Excel 365, you actually have the pivot by function that lets you create a pivot with a formula. So if you prefer doing it with formulas, then this is an option that you could look at as well. So you can kind of mix and match those options. So they are worth exploring. I think pivots are pretty neat, and if you do use them, I think there's some value to be gained there. Okay, let's come out of that, and let's refresh to see what we're dealing with, and take off of the top. So, question from Ruth here: when you get data from a PDF, is there a way to load all of the pages or the tables into one worksheet in one go? This is probably more of a PDF question than an Excel one. It depends a lot on what type of PDF you have. Some PDFs are essentially just a photograph of a document. They don't have any text in them, and you can't really work with them at all. A more structured PDF, you might be able to extract the figures from in an automated way using either a get data option or by selecting and copying over in some way. But it depends quite a lot on how your PDF is structured as to what the best way of doing that is. It's going to be a little bit tricky, unfortunately. And this is another one where it might be better for you to ship us a example of the kind of PDF you're working with, and we can have a look at that offline and get a suggested answer to you, Ruth. So happy to have something, send it into hello@cipfa.org and tell them that it's related to this webinar, and it'll make its way over to us, and we'll see what we can do depending on the type of data that you're working with. Let's move on. We're getting through these questions, by the way, and we've still got a good 25 minutes. So if you have any burning questions, do take the time to submit something. It doesn't have to be a big, complicated thing. It can be something small or silly. It can be anything you like. Do just sort of stick it in there. Otherwise, I'll pick and choose a few topics to cover at the end. So let's have a look at the next one from an anonymous attendee this time. Is there another way of deleting the blank or unused rows in a spreadsheet? I have tried all the usual ones and the suggestions on Google, but the scroll bar on the right still thinks that all of the rows are in use. So the scroll bar over here, and actually the other way to check it is if you go Control End. Oh, beg your pardon. Control. I need to do it slightly differently on my one because I've got a function like Control End. There we go. That will show you what Excel thinks is the used range of your spreadsheet. So in my case, it thinks I'm using columns A through L and rows 1 through 102. And that's important. And the reason why it's important is because Excel worksheets go all the way out to column XFD, which is the 16,384th column, and row 1,048,576. So that is a very big space, but Excel doesn't allocate any computer memory or processing power to the parts of the spreadsheet that you're not using. So essentially the file size and the speed of calculation will be just based on the top left-hand corner, the tiny little corner at the top where you're actually using the spreadsheet, and the rest of it will be left alone. If Excel ends up thinking that more of your spreadsheet is in use than it really is, then, so for example, if some formula gets copied down to, or like placed in a really distant row or column, it can think that your spreadsheet is much bigger than it really is and allocate a bunch of memory and processing power to rows and columns that actually aren't really part of your spreadsheet, and it can make it slow and awkward to use. So that's to understand, first of all, what the problem is. Now, there are a few things that you can do to try to improve that. So you can, first of all, clear everything out of any rows and columns you're not using. So I might say, select M out to XFD here, and I can use this eraser from the home menu and clear all. And same for the rows. And then, importantly, in Excel, you will also then need to save the file, close it, and reopen it. And if you do, that should clear Excel's memory of what the used range is. And when you reopen it, it should know about what is actually in use and recalculate. So that is definitely an option that you can take. Very new versions of Excel, and I haven't actually checked if I've got it in this version, I don't think I do, actually have a tool to help you deal with specifically excess data and let you kind of kick start that process manually. I don't have that version, I don't believe, on the CIPFA version of it. There is also a VBA way of doing it. So there's a VBA property called use range that you can detect or set that you could use to forcefully override that setting. So if there is something weird going on, you could use VBA to forcefully constrain the used range of your worksheet, but that's a bit dangerous because if you accidentally constrain it and exclude something that really is in use, it could get lost. So that would be a kind of emergency measure that I would try to avoid if possible. In most cases, clear alling the unused area, clearing all the formats, clearing all the content, saving, closing, and then reopening the workbook should sort the problem. But there are more drastic measures are available if you need to. I'm going to open up the Q&A again, and then I'm going to just leave it for a moment while I take another drink, and then we'll move on to something for the next questions. Let's refresh. Okay, so let's take the top question, which is from Matt. So Matt asks, have been updating some of our worksheets with Power Query. Excellent, do like Power Query. To pull out budgets over the next 5 years. Could manage to get it to show the total of the columns, but couldn't get it to show the totals of the rows as well. Any help would be much appreciated. Okay, so my example data doesn't, that I was using for my Power Query earlier, obviously doesn't have numbers. So let me just take a moment to talk about, first of all, what we're trying to do here. Power Query is very much designed to do column-based operations. It is assuming that your rows are independent fields of information and that you want to do things to each column individually, not across ways, which is why it can be a bit of a struggle to do things like adding across. It's not really designed to do that. Now, there are, of course, situations when you might be dealing with data where you do want to have that. Really, probably the best thing to do is to use the Power Query to generate the data and then create the sums in the outside of that. So use the Power Query to manipulate and create the data that you want, and then feed that source data into a pivot table or something like that and have that do the calculation step, because that's probably going to be an easier way to have your data set up. So you might end up creating a Power Query process that gives you a label, for example, a cost center label, a month label, and then a numeric amount, and just creates that data, and then the output of that Power Query is then put into a pivot table where you then actually do the row-wise and column-wise calculations to it. You can do things like creating total rows in Power Query, but it tends to be quite involved, and I think it's probably not going to be the easiest way to do it. I would probably not pursue doing it entirely in Power Query because I don't think that's really what it's best set up for. You could probably do something like you can transpose a table in Power Query, so swap the rows and the headers, and you could do something like that and then repeat the process that you've done to create the column totals and then flip it back again. So you could do it with a workaround, but I think probably the better solution is not to do everything there in Power Query, but to do some of it in a pivot table or another calculation engine instead. That's probably how I would approach that one, Matt. So let's have a look. Oh, let me just dismiss. Thank you very much, Matt. I'm just going to get your thanks out of the Q&A though. And let's refresh to see what's up on top. How are we doing on time? Just got about 20 minutes, so we'll take a bit of time on these questions. I can go back to some of the early ones and do them in a little bit more detail or show what I'm talking about if it comes to it. Or of course, you can keep on sending in questions and we'll take them as we go. So Gail's question, first of all, is there a way to keep frozen panes? For example, to keep your headings visible when you are also using the new window option to view on two monitor screens. So for those that aren't familiar, let me first of all introduce each of these examples in turn and talk about them a little bit more. So let me go find, here we go. So this is some nominal ledger data that I've got in here as an example of something that we could look at depending. If I'm exploring and looking at data down here in the row 3800 region, I don't necessarily know what each of these dates means anymore because I've lost my headers. I don't know what's what anymore. So first of all, just if you've not seen it before, there is this option and it lives on the View tab called Freeze Panes, and you can use that to, for example, I might want to say I want to keep, if I put my cursor here, I can say freeze panes, and everything above where my selection was and to the left of my selection was will now stay on the sheet. Even if I scroll around, I can still see it. So that's one thing that Gail's asking about, the unfreeze panes. The other option that we're talking about here is the View New Window option. So let's just refreeze these panes. And if I press New Window, you can see that what has happened is that now my workbook says your question's answered -2, and that's because I also have -1. So I now have two windows which are each individually looking into the same workbook. So I have two views of the same workbook, and that's helpful if I'm comparing tabs. So I might be looking at a figure on this tab over here and a figure on this tab over here, and I have two ways of seeing that. And if I'm working with multiple monitors, I could have, full screen each of these on two different monitors to compare between them. And what Gail's asking about is, if you've got freeze panes on the first window, when you create the new window, they are not there. Unfortunately, there isn't a workaround there. The freeze pane settings are specific to each of these two views. So you would have to create them again on the second view. And you can actually have multiple views. You have 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. That being said, if I were to save this workbook in this state and then close it, next time I opened it, it would have two windows again, and each of them would have the freeze pane setting that I had made. So I could have it so that my workbook is always opening in two windows, and that would be one way of doing that. The other solution to this problem, however, is to do something similar but not using freeze panes. If you go to our trusty friend, the Format as Table option, and format your data as a table, let's say with this formatting, tables automatically freeze the header row. So if I scroll down, even down here, the header row is, in fact, not just frozen, but it's actually merged into the column identifier. So instead of ABCD, we're seeing account, description, enter date. So that will keep those values visible to me, even if I'm coming somewhere way down here. And because that is not this table is not something that is depending on which window I'm looking at in. So any window that I created would have that same behavior. So that is another option that you could look at as well. So either of those might be suitable for your situation, Gal. Let's go back to the Q&A list. Okay, let's move on to Kathy's question. Let me just give it a refresh. How do you know which Excel version you're using? Oh, now this used to be a much simpler question to answer because there would be a new version of Excel every 3 or 4 years, and it would be in the name of the file when you were using it, and you would be able to see quite simply what you were using. These days, you have to go to your file account options to see which version and which build you have, current and what channel you are in About Excel. So if you're using Microsoft 365, which most of us are these days, you will have slightly different versions of Excel. And in particular, you are able to sign up for, in the options menus, you can sign up for, I can't remember where the option is, it's under account somewhere. Depending on the license and how your work IT system is set up, you might be able to sign up to get the kind of inside track. So there is you can see features that are in preview, and that would mean you would have access to the very, very latest versions. So whenever Microsoft puts out something that's in a trial version, it would become available to you straight away. So on my own personal laptop right now, I have the equals Copilot function they've just released into the Insider channel, and that will go out to the wider versions of Microsoft 365 eventually. Unfortunately, there's just a lot of different versions of Excel now with slightly different waves of functionality being added to them. It usually is the case that almost all the functionality is almost all the same for everybody, but the very newest stuff isn't necessarily synced up. So you now have to rely a little bit on what version, what build you're seeing here on the account screen if you want to be 1000% sure that you've got what other people have got. That is a bit of a nuisance. I wish it were not so, but unfortunately, that is the world in which we live. Okay, let me just mark Kathy's question as done. I'm going to take another drink before I come to this question from Anonymous, but also just to make sure, of course, that you've got time. If there are other things you'd like to submit, we've still got a little bit more than 10 minutes to go. So do, if you've got anything that's on your mind, send it in. Okay, so anonymous attendee asks, can you demonstrate a formula where you can highlight a cell in a color if certain criteria are met? So this kind of goes back actually to the very first question that we were talking about actually. So I did this on the invoice table. This is an example of, again, what's called a conditional formatting rule. Now, there are a lot of conditional formatting things you can do that don't require formulas. So let's say, for example, if I come to home, conditional formatting, there are lots of things I can do that don't require any kind of formula writing. So I could highlight my invoice amounts here, and I could say data bar with a solid green fill. There you go. That is a conditional format. Each number now has a bar behind it that shows how big of a value it is, and that's in comparison to the range as a whole. So that is scaled to the size of the figures. If I were to make one of these figures really big, then essentially it's the only one that's got any green on it at all. Take a few zeros off and you'll get something more like that. So that's something that you can do very easily. Likewise, you can do things like color scales that will do highlighting of figures with red. You know, this is red for high numbers, green for low. That's the other way around. There's a whole bunch of these that you can do that are automatically applied. You can also do things like top and bottom rules. So you can say, for example, the top 10 items. So that will automatically highlight the top 10 items in a certain color. Or you can get into the full options by going to conditional formatting, new rules. So let's highlight the vendors, for example, and then there's absolutely squillions of options back here that you can use to do anything you like. So you could say, for example, formatting only cells that contain a certain value. So let's say is equal to, so I want to highlight any times where the cell is equal to PNP PLC with a yellow fill. So I can make, so I've I've put too many extra steps there. Oh, I didn't need to type the quote marks there. I don't use that function very often. There we go. So that's a sort of simple rule that you can make. Earlier in the recording, we made this more complicated rule where we are using a lookup function to take the name of the approver, look it up in this table, identify whether it's high or low, and highlight red if it is. So you can make essentially anything that you could make into a specific cell, like a specific cell formula, you could make into a conditional formatting rule pretty much instead, if you wished. There are times where it's less clear because the formula is hidden to the user. They can't see easily why that cell is red. So you shouldn't do this unless you've clearly labeled and explained what's going on with the conditional format. But you can use these rules to apply these kinds of colors if that's something that you're interested in doing. And as I say, you can look at the more detail option if you want. So that's that one. Let's move on. So another anonymous question here. Can you stop a table doing autofill? So once again, let's go back to our table example that I made. Let me think. It was over on this tab. Nope, not this one, this one. So I made this automatic little table here, and I showed how when I type a formula, let me just do this from the beginning, times 2, automatically when I press enter, it will fill down the whole column. That is something that you can control. So there's a little menu here that appears when that happens. You can use to control the autocorrect options. So for example, you can switch off include new rows and columns in table. You can switch off fill formulas in tables to create calculated columns if you want. If you only want to do it on an ad hoc basis, there are a couple of ways of doing it. If after you've typed one thing, you then press undo, it will undo the autofill and leave you just with that one formula. The other option is if your formula already contains some sort of hard-coded value somewhere, then it will automatically not copy and paste it down because you have something in the column already that isn't a formula. So then it will not do it in that case either. That being said, in this I am going to overwrite with that formula just to get that better basis out. So there is an option to turn that off or to either on a case-by-case basis or across the board if you want to. That being said, most of the time having consistent column formulas is a good thing and you wouldn't want to do that, but you do have that option if you really are needing to do that. You could do so. I can see we've had another question in fact, a couple, so let's have a look. Let's press done. Okay, nicely, we have 2 questions on the same theme here. So Nikki asks, could you please give us a demonstration of how to use XLOOKUP? I'm not hugely familiar with this function. What is it used for? And Rashid, who's asked, what are the advantages of using XLOOKUP compared to VLOOKUP? Happy to answer both those questions. So we'll take them together. Let's go back to my invoice table, and I'm going to delete this and recreate my example. So first of all, assuming that you've never done any lookup formula at all, let's talk about what a lookup formula is, and then we'll take it from there to why XLOOKUP is the best way of doing them. A lookup formula takes a label, looks it up in a table, and returns a value. So for example, if I wanted to look at my approver name here, take my approver name, look it up in my approvers and risk level over here that I've created, and then return what their risk level was, a lookup formula, and there are actually quite a lot of these in Excel, is a way of doing that. So let me make a new column called risk level and do it like this. So the way you write an XLOOKUP is like this, equals XLOOKUP. There are 3 key inputs here, the lookup value, which is the cell that we're going to look for, the lookup array, which is where we're going to look for it, and the return array, which is where what we're going to return once we have found it. So in my case, I'm going to look for the approver name that is in cell F3. I'm going to look for it in the list of approvers over here, and I am going to return the risk levels here. So input, where to look, what to return. It helps if I type the close parenthesis at the end of the formula. And what have I forgotten to $sign? Yes, I forgot to put a $sign on K2, so it's not copying correctly. There we go. So the dollar signs here tell Excel that even as the formula moves down, I don't want the cell references to these places to move down. These two need to stay where they are. So that automatically searches for each of these. So what's better about this than a VLOOKUP? For starters, in a VLOOKUP, you have to have the labels on the far left and then the data to the right of that, and you have to count how many columns to the right of it is. In this case, you're directly pointing at the two columns, so you don't have to do any counting. VLOOKUP breaks if you insert columns in the middle of your lookup table. XLOOKUP does not. VLOOKUP also the default setting for VLOOKUP is to take approximate matches, and you have to type 0 or false at the end to say that you only want specific matches, which is rubbish. XLOOKUP only looks for exact matches by default. If you wanted to do approximate matching, you have to explicitly choose to do that, which I think is a much, much better option. It does have some other things. So, for example, it has an if not found input. So let's say that let's say that on this line I had managed to misspell the name of one of my people here. And oh yes, beg your pardon. I know what's gone. That's because my data is different size now. Duplicate I'll leave that better. So, and what I'm going to do also is I'm going to paste values. There's just for the example. There we go. Right. So just fixing my example here. So in my example here, I've got an error in this column because there's a typo in the approver name. In my formula, I actually have this optional input called if not found, where I can do something like type approver not found, and it will now use my default value in that case. So it is automatically applying you can make this with a regular VLOOKUP using the if error or if NA function, but this you can just do it as part of the same formula. So it's just a more flexible, quicker to calculate, more reliable version of VLOOKUP. It is a much more recent formula. It was only added a few years ago, and it's just a superior version. There are some other inputs here that you can choose to play around with, but I basically never need them. So the options do exist if you want them, but you don't actually ever need them. I'm just going to fix that conditional formatting formula that I made earlier, because the mucking around that I did has slightly broken it, but I can fix that easily enough. Let me do that. Yeah, that should do the trick. There we go. Just so that when I send the workbook, we send the workbook around afterward, you can see the finished version there. So XLOOKUP is just a more flexible version. Lookups in general, useful anytime that you need to find things based on a label. It only works if you have some sort of unique label, but it is used for things like, can I look up what balance this account had in the previous year? Or can I look up an exchange rate for a specific date? So I could look up the date in a table, find the matching exchange rate, and bring it over to where I'm doing my calculations. That could all be done using a lookup as well. So that's the kind of things that you would be using a lookup formula for. I believe we have cleared the open questions, and conveniently enough, I also believe that we are very close to the end of the time that we have together this afternoon. So let me just come back over to my slides to finish. So this was a wide-ranging talk on a lot of different Excel topics, but just as I mentioned, first of all, if you've got specific questions that you'd like help with, do send them along in to us using hello@sipford.org and mark it relating to this webinar, and what they'll send them along, and we'll see if we can help, including some of the examples where I just sort of gave a sort of general answer in lack of details. Secondly, a reminder that you do have access to, if you are a SIPFA member, some Excel training modules that you can get over a variety of different levels that you might be interested in having a look at. And then just to finally note that we have got a few other resources from our Tech in Focus series. So we have an AI prompt along. This was something that we did back in the summer, showing the use of an AI prompting exercise in real time to show you how to do it and how to do it well, get more out of it. Secondly, we did a webinar just last week with One Advanced and a podcast, and I beg your pardon as well. So this is actually CIPFA Speaks. This is our podcast. We did one on shaping AI for public good with One Advanced. So if you want to hear more about how to get the most out of the public sector and get the most out of AI, and that goes back to our very first question about AI in Excel as well, you can listen to that wherever you get your podcasts. And we talked a little bit about Power Query during the webinar today. If you want to get a bit more into that, you can look at the replay of our entire introduction to Power Query as well. And we'll share those links with you after the webinar, live webinar, along with the workbooks that I worked with today, so that you can have a look at the examples in a bit more detail and at your own pace, as well as checking back over the recording. So I think that's everything from me. And it looks like we're all clear on the questions. So in which case, just remains to say thank you very much indeed for coming. Hope you have a very good afternoon and happy excelling.